What's up guys, this is Joseph with Slidio Studios, and today we want to give you some tips and tricks for filming in low light. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So before we begin into actually how to film in low light situations, I kind of want to talk about the camera that we're using because that's, very important when it comes to low light situations, especially in low light situations. So we're going to be using the Lumix GH5S, which is a slightly better version of the GH5 in terms of low light performance. It doesn't have a bigger sensor, however. It's the same sensor size at micro four thirds. The difference is the GH5S has slightly improved bigger sensor size per pixel, which improves the low light performance. We're not talking about a huge improvement, maybe like 1 or 1.5 stop higher. So it's not a huge improvement in terms of ISO performance, but it's a little bit there. And the reason I think a micro four thirds sensor is perfect for a video like this is if we're gonna go with something like a full frame, of course it's gonna look good no matter what we shoot at it. So like things like the Sony A7 and the Panasonic S series. So I think the micro four thirds system is a perfect choice for this. And a lot of cameras tend to use this micro four thirds system, including the Blackmagic Cinema 4K, which is another very popular cinema camera. So with that out of the way, these tips and tricks should be able to work on a lot of your cameras, given that you have a decent sensor size and something close to micro four thirds, or maybe a bit smaller or a bit bigger. You should be able to get the same results that we get in this video. Now, if you do have a smaller sensor, or if you're using the GH5, which doesn't have the improved low light performance as the version I'm using, then you do have to be a little bit more conservative, especially with your ISO ranges. I would say go half a stop or one stop lower than what I'm doing on the GH5S. Alright, so with that out of the way, now we want to talk about lenses. So I'm going to be using these. These are the Mica Cinema lenses. They go down to an aperture of t2.2, which is very, very fast given their price point and size. Now I know there are lenses like the Rokinon lenses that can go all the way down to t1.5. I actually personally have a lens like that. And the reason I'm not using it for this video is because the lens itself is very, very long and it's pretty much impossible to balance on a gimbal. But at T1.5, it's so soft and you have so much chromatic aberration and a lot of issues. It's very hard to keep your subject in focus. I think T2.2 is a really good choice. Now, I will be using the 25mm version, which I'm using to record myself. So what I have in hand is the 16mm. They're the same size though. For this, the good thing with cinema lenses is you really get that nice color and lens flare. The problem with them is that it's a full manual lens. So for a lot of people, these are not the lens that I would recommend for a lot of your use cases. So in that case, I actually got another lens here. This one is really popular. Anyone with a micro four thirds system should probably own one of this lens. This is like around $100 or $200, I think. I'll show a link in the description. And this is a 25mm f1.7, I believe, a simple Lumix G lens, and this will give you a very similar low light capability. Now, for those of you guys that don't know, t-stop versus f-stop. T-stop is measuring the actual light coming from the lens, so it's a lot more accurate, versus f-stop is a measurement of the actual aperture diameter, so it's not as precise. But to help you guys know what settings is like, I found that at T2.2, which is the maximum that the Mica Cinema lenses go to, it's around the same amount of exposure as f1.7. Maybe f1.7 is just a tad bit brighter on this lens specifically. So you should be able to get similar performance if you were to go with a 25mm f1.7 lens. Now, there are certain other things that you should know about low light situations is where noise are coming from. So a lot of times when you're doing video work, noise comes from the shadows of the video. So you want to think about your subjects, right? You want to try to keep that in the highlight section. Now on the GH5S, after a long experimentation, I found that if I want clean low light footage, I would choose to shoot at ISO 6400. I would not go anything above that. And if I really want to push it, I would push it just like half a stop higher than 6400. Just because anything above that, it just becomes a little bit too grainy or a little bit too soft. The camera itself starts doing noise reduction. It just doesn't look that good anymore. So I tend to stay at 6400. If you're on a GH5 or Micro Four Thirds cameras that are similar performance in terms of low light to the GH5, I would say maybe go half a stop or a full stop. So maybe 3200 or anywhere in between 3200 and 6400. I would not go close to 6400 if you want a clean looking footage. So that is very important to note. In terms of camera settings, in terms of other settings, is I like to shoot at 1/50th shutter speed. Sometimes you can go 1/60th if you want a slightly higher frame rate. I tend to find 1/50th to be fine. That's usually around 25 frames per second. You multiply the frame rate by 2, that's how fast your shutter speed should be. So 1/50th should be pretty good for cinematic looking shots, and still give you a decent amount of light. Of course, the lower your shutter speed, the more light that you give. You might be able to push 160. I would not even try to film at 60 frames per second, because then your shutter speed has to be somewhere around like at least 120, and that's just ridiculously high. So I would try to just film at 30 frames per second. You're not going to get those advantages anyways. And then I just shoot wide open on the Mica cinema lenses, because they look really, really sharp even at T2.2, which they are pretty impressive. There is slightly more chromatic aberration, especially with the 25mm Mica T2.2 lenses. I also notice a lot of chromatic aberration with this lens here, the Lumix G lenses. But those are they're kind of distinctive chromatic aberration. They're really, really blue. So I think that with some editing, you can actually get rid of them if you do find that to be a problem. For me personally, especially on the Mica, I find it quite normal. You know, I've seen a lot of professional shots and stuff with a lot more chromatic aberration than what this lens is giving, and the chromatic aberration on the Mica is actually quite pleasing in my opinion compared to other looking chromatic aberration. I know it sounds kind of weird, but I find that not to be a huge problem, but you can always try to remove in post. And filming at high speeds is pretty much the only way to be able to get low light performance, especially on the Micro Four Thirds sensor. Now, the other thing is on the Lumix cameras and a lot of professional cinema cameras in this price range, we're using the Micro Four Thirds system, is you got to choose your picture profile. Now, I understand that log is probably the preferred picture profile for a lot of situations, but what I found with log is in low light, you don't actually take much benefit of log footage. The point of log is to preserve the highlights and the shadows. You don't really have that issue with low light. You know, everything is sort of just in the shadows. And you don't have, and even if things are in highlights, it's not like super overly exposed. Another thing I found is that when you try to grade log footage that's low light, you end up bringing a lot of noise. It doesn't look very clean or very sharp. You start seeing color shift problems. There's a lot of issues, and you know, basically you don't even get the benefit of log in the first place, and you end up bringing more noise to your image. So instead, what I like to do on the Lumix is you can either shoot in standard picture profile if you want to get footage right out of the camera, you don't want to do any kind of color grading. Standard is usually the good choice for that. If you want to have a little bit more flexibility, you can go with neutral. Or on the Lumix cameras, I tend to go with Cine D. Cine D is sort of like a toned down version of log. It doesn't have the same dynamic range as log, but it lacks in saturation and contrast, which allows you to do a lot of editing in post. So while we're talking about picture profiles and stuff like that, we should also talk about the codec that I'm using. I'm shooting at 1080p at 200 megabits per second, all-eye codec, and this will give me a lot of flexibility, especially since I am still using Cine D. Although not as intensive as log, I'm not going to be pushing the colors as much. I will still have to grade it a lot in post, so I need to make sure I have a codec that is very sturdy. All-eye is pretty much the codec to go. Of course, if you have an external recorder like the Atmos Ninja 5, then you should try to go with Apple ProRes. That's usually the better codec. And yeah, so that's pretty much the whole camera setup in general. And then a few tips and tricks before we go and check out the footage and actually start filming is that, again, you want to try to keep your subject in the highlights. Even if you're at a high ISO, if your subject remains in the highlights, you're not going to see a lot of noise. You only see the noise in the shadows, which, although that sucks, it doesn't really matter that much when your subject is not, compared to your subject. It's not as important if the shadows are are sort of grainy and your subject is still in detail. Of course, try to go with low ISO, but let's just say you can't, then try to keep your subject in the highlights. Some tips and tricks is we were filming on a school campus, and we tend to find that there are some street lamps and stuff. So if you could, the best thing to do is to put your subjects near the street lamps. Usually that helps brighten things up. Sometimes that light could be a little bit harsh, but that's also sort of what it looks like in low light situations. And then I would also try to film in front of like a store window or something like that. You'll see one of the examples, and that just really helps up brighten it. Even if you can't lower the ISO, at least put your subjects in a brighter spot so that you're going to see less grain. And another thing is white balance. White balance is a huge challenge with low light situations because all street lamps have different color. Not even if they look exactly the same, they might, they're cheap lights, so they might tone a little bit towards green or magenta and stuff, and it's just hard to match. Another thing is the high pressure sodium lamps look absolutely horrible. So I would try to avoid those if you can for lighting up your subject, because the CRI of those are just really bad. Even if you have your white balance set correctly, you won't be able to distinguish any kind of color with that. So what I like to do on the when I'm filming low light is, and this is another reason why I like to film in higher codec, is so that if the white balance was slightly off, now we're not talking about really off, like we're not talking about from tungsten to daylight or something like that, but if it was slightly off, like if it's just slightly too warm or too magenta or too green, I can easily go in and post and edit that without affecting the image, and that's the advantage of shooting in 10-bit 422 all-I formats. And yeah, so I would try to, maybe you might be able to get away with auto exposure. It really depends on the street that you're on. Some streets use LED lights and they're more daylight color. I would just bring a white balance card with you. Just try your best, and just know that, please, as long as you record at higher codec, you should be able to make those small adjustments to make the colors look a lot better. So yeah, now let's go ahead and check out the footage. All right, so let's go ahead and check out the footage that we've gotten here. So this was shot at ISO 6400. You do see a tad bit of grain, just very, very little, but it's very, very minimal considering this was at 6400. And overall, it's very useful. Like I said, especially here on the highlight section, it's a relatively clean footage. It's not super detailed. There was no direct light on our subject, so this was sort of like a bad example, but it kind of shows the capabilities of this camera. This again shot at 6400. You can see some noise, especially in the shadow. Very, very slight though. Very, very minimal noise. Let's skip this here. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So we have this bright light here in front of us. So we put our subject right in front of it, and even at a high ISO, you can see how it is so much more detailed here, especially on the shirt, and it just overall looks a lot better. Here is a really pushing the camera to its limit here. We're actually just using the smartphone here, turning up the brightness really high up to be able to reflect the light, and it gives us nice soft light with a decent CRI, given that you're looking at a wide screen. You can see some noise here in the shadow, or not really noise, I would say it's more like grain, but the fact that the highlight itself is very clear, you can see the detail in the eyes and stuff like that, is pretty impressive. And this was also at 6400, and you can see some of the details in the clouds. Just overall very clean shots. Coming in over here, this is what happens when you just have it fully in the shadow. It's not unusable at 6400, but you can definitely see that it's really hard to see, and that's just the nature of being in the lower light level here. And you can see details here in the clouds. Again, here smartphone, it seems to be like a very good light, and it seems like a very natural light, like you can imagine if you're filming like a short film or something, having your actor using a smartphone to call someone or whatever, and from the light of the phone, it's a very natural light. I believe there is one example here. Oh, and this is just showing the landscapes. You can see that even though this is at high ISO, you can see details relative to the tree. There is very little chromatic aberration on the logo here. It's a little bit over here, but it's really isn't that bad. These are all filmed on the mica lenses. This one does have a little bit more noise in the shadow, but it's still usable shots. Like it really is usable. And this shot right here is just light up by this one lamp over here. A little bit chromatic aberration there, but overall very clean footage. This was shot in a more orange light, so if I were to go back in post, I would probably put a little filter. This was actually shot at a slightly higher ISO, I believe around 80,000. I'm not exactly sure, so that's why you do see a little bit more grain. And then this is a perfect example of finding a storefront. So you can see these sodium lamps here with the very low CRI. It's not really affecting our subject because it's all the way over here. It actually gives a nice backlight almost. And this is just shot right directly in front of a store where it's really nice and bright, and you can see that the shadows may have some grain or some loss in detail, but overall the main subject here, the thing that's in the highlight, is very, very detailed, very impressive. And this was the example that we saw directly under street lamp. It's a bit harsh light, so I would probably not use something like this, but if you're in a pinch, you can definitely get usable footage. And this is just showing the focus breathing on the lens and the footage you'll be able to get with it. And you can kind of see here on the mica lenses, it has a pretty good lens flare. So yeah, this should give you a basic idea, as long as you try to keep your subject in highlights. Even if you can't, it's not the end of the world, but I would really highly recommend it just to put that noise away from your subject. Anyway, so I hope you like the footage that you see today, and yeah, it's actually quite impressive. Like ISO 6400 at T2.2, especially on the GH5S, looks super clean, and that will give you a lot of capabilities. Even when we did have subjects in the shadow, you could still see a lot of detail, which is just really, really impressive. Some other tips and tricks is, if you are going to be filming on a set, you know your situation, you know your location really well, I would probably just bring like a YN300 LED light and a Sony MF battery. You don't even need it that bright. I would say even 1% brightness on the YN300 is enough to at least put your subject in the highlights. Of course, you would want to get a pretty tall stand so you can mount the light up so it can look like it's a street lamp. Anyway, so that's it for this video. I hope you found this helpful in shooting low light, and share some footage. And I'll also link down below the full footage without all the narration and stuff, so you can see what the GH5S low light performance is like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with another video.